the noon whistle is blowing here at Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. This is Steve Larson with the Forage Dairyman editorial staff, welcoming you to this month's Forage Dairyman webinar. Just taking a look at this point in time in the year, the crop year, feed supply outlook, and we look forward to having actually a joint presentation today. And we also want to take this opportunity to thank Zinpro Performance Minerals for their support, their sponsorship of today's webinar. Let me mention again, just briefly, that for those of you who are with us, if you'd like to print out the PowerPoints, just go to the handouts section of your menu there, and you can have a couple of options to print out, and you can follow along. I know that there's going to be some interesting charts and tables today that will be good information to keep your hands on, so you're very welcome to do that if you like. We have a nice group out there today, and with we always welcome the support of Jim Balston at the University of Illinois, who is sort of the man behind the gears that keeps these things going, and then Patty Hutjens from the Forage Dairyman staff up here and her technical help as well. So I will begin by introducing our team today. Mike Rankin is the editor of Hay Forage Grower magazine. Actually happens to be a publication of the W.D. Ward & Sons company. Mike has come to Forage Dairyman out of a long and productive career in extension and forage work at the county level, and I'm going to actually, Mike, have you introduce, just say a few comments about your background, and then we'll switch things over to Mike, and we'll get this thing going. Mike, so tell us, Mike, just a minute, briefly, where you're from, where you went to school, and anything else about you that we would like to know.
Okay, well, probably most people don't really care, but I'll give you the quick synopsis. I grew up in Ohio and went to college at Iowa State University, got both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree there, and then spent 27 years as a county extension agent at the University of Wisconsin in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and have always focused primarily on forage crops, and recently retired about a year and a half ago and came to W.D. Horde to be managing editor of Hay Forage Grower magazine.
Just wanted to say a word of introduction to Mike Hutjens, longtime extension dairyman now to University of Illinois, native of Northeast Wisconsin, did some extension work in Minnesota before heading down to the University of Illinois. And with those comments, I will let you guys get going. Who's up first today?
Well, I'm on first here because of the Cubs, but I'll start off and then I'll pass it off to the other M, kind of the M&M team as far as that goes out there as well. So today's webinar, we're going to be looking at the marching orders here. We're going to look briefly kind of at the economics of milk pricing and related economic factors, because obviously that's going to be huge in the dairy area. Then Mike's going to come on and talk about his view on forage production here in the United States and in the Midwest, forages myself. Then we'll wrap up with a few evaluation things and be done for the day as far as that goes. So very briefly, Steve and Mike, here's kind of what we're looking at. My understanding is that we had a tough Friday on the milk price, that our futures have dropped a bit. But anyway, the milk price is probably right about below break even, at least here in Illinois, at $16.35. The good news is it's up from a couple of months ago. Milk fat and milk protein, interestingly, you can see them listed. Milk protein finally got ahead of milk fat, which reflects a bit of our cheese market more than the milk fat production there. You'll see that cost pop up later. Our feed costs about $5.80 a hundredweight for feed costs, so feed's going to be pretty economical this year. We're well aware the exports markets are down because of the prices that we're seeing in New Zealand and EU. Bull calves have dropped in price. Cull cows have dropped back a bit as well, so the beef enterprise isn't nearly what it was a year ago. And of course, we're getting lots of questions about the MPP, and of course with that milk, with milk prices and feed prices, lots of interesting discussion occurring there as well. So certainly, as we set this thing up, it's been a challenging year, and Mike's going to spend more time on this. Certainly, we had spring rains, summer droughts, especially remaining in the California on the West Coast, but especially a new area, New York and parts of Canada, the northeastern part of the United States, under some dry conditions. A lot of forage being harvested, at least here in the Midwest. We're hearing cuts as many as 5 or 6 cuttings. At Expo, people are saying we aren't going to take the 5th cutting this year. We have haylage coming out of our ears. And of course, 10 cuttings come from our colleagues on the West Coast. Then we had this unique rain we'll talk about a bit later that really hit us here in the corn silage harvest period as far as that goes. And then, of course, huge corn, canola, and soybean crops as well. So let's take a quick overview of these yields. They're big, no question about it. 15 billion bushels of corn. The target is 174 bushels per acre. Some of our guys are disappointed in Illinois. Instead of getting 300 bushels, they got 260 bushels per acre with a target price of $3.30 a bushel. If you talk to our colleagues in Iowa that are away from the river a bit, they think it's going to go below $3 a bushel. So those guys, Mike, you may want to comment, are going to be tough shape. Soybean yields, 4.2 million bushels at this point, averaging over 50 bushels per acre. But Illinois, we've seen some 70s here. Price, again, $9.75. Fuzzy cottonseed, those are Illinois prices delivered to central Illinois. $2.45 for gin run, which means it's coming around the field. And they start ginning last week, was the word I got received from one of my specialists as far as that goes. If you put it into storage, you could lock in prices last Friday at $2.65. I have no idea what Hurricane Matthew may have done to those cottonseed prices, because obviously North Carolina is a source of fuzzy cottonseed, and they had some challenges and still do. Canola meal is going to be pretty abundant depending on the crushing demand for the oil, and at least one estimate came in here about $100 below soybean meal price. So certainly these are going to bode for fairly economical there. So let's open our polling question up, Jim, and see what our people want to vote here. Here are questions. What are you going to be looking for changes here with your clients or on your farms here in 2016 and 17? And you have 5 choices, and Steve will vote for Horge Dairyman. Number 1, we're going to feed more corn and grain because it's going to be cheap this year. Number 2, we will feed more corn silage because it's a bowser of a corn crop. Number 3, we're going to feed more legume and grass this year because of our forage situation inventory. We will feed less fuzzy cottonseed, and I may feed some soybean seed as an oil source. Jim, can they do multiple choices? So you can vote more than one. So pick all that you think are going to fit on your situation. And the polls are open, so you're off and running. So you can vote, unlike last night's debate, you can vote for 2 or 3 if you wish. Steve, what's going to happen at Horge Dairyman?
Well, tell you, we have had bumper crops of alfalfa the last 2 years. In fact, we took 5 cuttings this year, and we have alfalfa silage bags everywhere, and we're going to be bumping the level of that up relative to corn silage, although we've gotten some 30-ton corn silage also this year, and so more alfalfa silage would be my pick for the Horge Dairyman farm.
Okay, well, let's close the polls here. Enough for you Republicans. You don't want to vote, fine. We understand. Jim has shared that right now. So you can see that it's interesting. Multiple choices here. You can see more corn silage was the most popular choice here. You can see that more corn grain. So you nutritionists, you're going to earn some money there this year. You can see the numbers. So it looks like business as usual. Perhaps a few more of the soybean seed. We may talk about that more in the Q&A period as well. So let's go ahead and move on. And we're going to turn the microphone over to Mike Rankin. You heard him a bit earlier. And Mike, what's the state of forages in 2016 from your perspective?
Okay, thanks, Mike. We'll try to get through this in fairly efficient order and just kind of look at the start off here anyway, looking at the big picture. If I can get my slides to run here. Here we go. And this is U.S. May 1st hay stocks, and the USDA looks at hay stocks in May and then again in December. And what we note here is that our stocks have climbed from a low point in 2013 following the couple years of drought. and went back up a little bit higher than 2015 even in 2016 this year. But we're at stock levels now that really you have to go back 10 years ago was the last time we were at the point where we are now. And from an inventory standpoint, as I talk to a lot of people, with few exceptions, all talk about very good inventory. All right, this next graph, we're looking at August alfalfa prices, and USDA does average prices for every month. And a couple of caveats to these numbers. First of all, this is an average of all quality types, so it's not just the prime dairy hay. It's alfalfa hay, but it can range from anything from fair all the way up to supreme. The other thing about USDA numbers, when you look at their average price, is that it's weighted by volume. In other words, states where a lot of hay is moved and sold, a state like California, for example, is going to have a lot more influence on this price than a smaller state where you don't get as much alfalfa that gets purchased. But as you look at this graph, it's pretty clear that these last 2 years we have come down pretty significantly from those peak years running anywhere from 2011 to 2014, where the average price was near $200 a ton at the same juncture in time. And I think as you look at the marketplace, it's pretty easy to reflect that. Most places this year are running anywhere from $15 to $20 a ton less than at the same point last year. Some more big picture observations just from my standpoint. One of the things that we're still scratching our head on just a little bit is that when USDA came out with acres planted to alfalfa or alfalfa grass mixtures, it was actually higher in 2016 than 2015, and really nobody expected that. We don't know if it's real or not. It was almost 300,000 acres, or 300,000 acres more. So we'll see, I guess, at the end of the year whether this comes to fruition. One caveat with USDA acres is that if you even harvest it one time, they count that. And we heard a lot of reports, especially out west, where they were taking one cut and then moving to another crop that offered a little more profit potential. In a lot of cases out west, and in other parts of the country, growers are thinking that they're just too close, or maybe even a little bit below cost of production, and they're moving in to other crops. But certainly these acres don't reflect that, and we'll check that at the end of the year to see if that changes any. Well, maybe a lot of people that are listening here this morning don't pay a lot of attention to U.S. alfalfa exports, and quite frankly, for a lot of years I didn't either. But I've come to realize that it does affect the price of hay domestically, because if hay doesn't move out of the country, it stays here in the country, and that affects our supplies, which then in turn affects what kind of prices we pay. But the export situation is really pretty interesting. And as we look at this graph, and this goes up through 2015, up through last year, the thing that really strikes you in the side of the head, most of all, is this red line, which is exports of alfalfa to China. And you can see that since 2011, that has just gone through the roof. And it's even higher as we've progressed through 2016. Japan, that used to be our largest export buyer, as recently as 2011, has actually come down a little bit. The UAE, countries like Saudi Arabia, came down quite a bit in 2015, but those numbers are back up again in 2016. So as you look at the trend on that purple line, it's actually going to be coming back up during this year, and South Korea just kind of plugs along. And again, these exports, especially in the western states, really affect what domestic hay prices are. Now, China, and keep in mind, this alfalfa is going to dairies over there, is a little bit of a contentious situation when you export, because they take no GMOs. So no Roundup Ready, none of the new reduced lignin GMO material, the Harv Extra trait, and so it has to be clean. And so that what that means out west is that a lot of those acres and growers, the farms I've been on and growers I've talked to out there, just don't plant any GMOs because they don't know whether it's going to a neighboring dairy necessarily or whether it'll be exported. One of the more interesting stories this year was earlier this year, Saudi Arabia. I talked about them earlier. They've actually taken a new approach. They've come into the U.S. and bought substantial acres, both in Arizona and California, spent upwards of $80 million to buy those acres, and are actually producing alfalfa for their dairies in Saudi Arabia over here and then shipping it over there. They have such a water issue over there that the government has basically said no more alfalfa, and so they're just moving their production here to the United States, and I should mention I've heard in other countries as well. So just kind of an interesting side note on the export situation. All right, let's talk a little bit about the weather. Mike alluded to some of the weird stuff that we've had this year, and it really has been a different kind of year, although I guess every year is a little different. It's certainly been a tough year to make generalizations, whether we were dry or whether we were wet, because you can pick any number of areas that would fit into that category. A lot of areas had rain early, but after planting. So planting, for the most part, took place in a fairly timely fashion. But then in some areas it got unexpectedly wet, dry. Other areas it stayed wet. And what I would just note on this graph as we look at, now this graph is 90-day precipitation from September 26th back. You can see a lot of these red areas, very heavy rains in the Midwest. In some areas, especially Iowa, Minnesota, into Wisconsin a little bit. But then also, looking at the green areas, the drier areas, we have some areas that we typically don't pick up into Pennsylvania, up into New York, up into the New England states. Some of the worst pasture ratings of the whole summer and all summer have come out of the Northeast, and that's just not a situation that you would normally expect. Also very wet down here in Louisiana. Arkansas had a considerable amount of crop damage because of wet conditions. And if we look at this a couple different ways, this is U.S. hay acres that are in a drought situation as of September 20th. And some of these areas have probably gotten rains here in the last 2 to 3 weeks that may bring them out. But again, this shows that not only the typical areas that we would expect to be dry out here in the western U.S., but take a look in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, all the way up and through New England. There's a big area down in the southeast, North Georgia. Down there, they're still very dry. So we have these dry areas of the U.S., but in contrast to those dry areas, we also have some very wet areas. I find this chart always to be interesting. This is looking at June through August of this year, basically the majority of the growing season. And so what this tells you, and these are state averages, so some averages or some states will have dry and wet, and it'll average out to an average year, I guess. But the green shades would be in this 122 years of records where that state ranked during the growing season as being either wet, the green side, or dry, the brown or tan sides. And so, for example, to give you an idea of this, let's take a look at Louisiana down here. It's got a 120. So this is only 122 years. So it's there's only been 2 years wetter than the one they've experienced this year, June through August. And if we look at the Midwest, states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, all very wet years relative to the last 122. Some of the wettest on record. By the same token, again, we see these areas up in New England and in the Northeast, that Massachusetts, for example, the 7th driest June through August that they've ever experienced. So quite a broad range of being either wet or dry. Just some comments that we're hearing, and we already talked about some of these. In many cases, it was early. It was wet conditions. A lot of the first crop got wet. This was kind of the second year of this, difficult making hay and haylage. And this was true, I found, across a lot of the U.S. So first crop, a lot of low quality, a lot of field damage in some cases. Third, fourth, fifth crops, mostly better. Again, made under both dry and wet conditions, depending upon what region you were in. And then the other thing is that through most of the summer, hay just wasn't moving all that much. Dairy inventories were very high. I was out in the West in California. Their sheds were full, and they weren't looking to buy a whole lot. Now, some of that has changed a little bit, but what they are buying is the real supreme quality type of hay. And from a selling perspective, some of the sellers are just simply waiting for price improvement before they want to go ahead and sell. Lots of lower quality forage available, as seems to usually be the case. Less high quality forage. Where it was dry, quantity is going to be more of an issue than quality. I know in states and parts of New York, Pennsylvania, they're talking about inventory being somewhat of an issue. The water situation is somewhat better than it was last year. Out in California, a little more water was available to produce alfalfa, but these California dairies are still feeding a lot less alfalfa in their rations than they used to. Checked the numbers just recently, 7.74 pounds of dry matter per cow on the Holstein farms in the second quarter of 2016. And then just to wrap up, each week we publish an electronic newsletter called eHay Weekly and report on the USDA prices for those states that report them. And you can see this was last week's numbers. You can see that numbers bounce around. There's quite a wide range in some states. Part of that is simply just due to the type of bale that we're talking about. Small square bales usually fetch a premium compared to certainly large round bales, with large squares being the predominant type, but also usually a little less than what folks are getting for the high quality small squares. So with that, Mike, I'll stop there and let you take it over.
Okay, Mike, we're going to be off and running. Phase 2 of our presentation is looking, well, what is that quality that we have out there? You saw quantities. You saw our situation from Mike Rankin. I want to recognize our 3 sources. They're listed here, 3 different labs, and some of them are unique. Dairy One primarily coming from the New York area up there, so you'll see those numbers as well. There's going to be a ton of numbers here showing at you, and I've got my my pointer to kind of pick them off here a little bit. And you want to study these in depth. I looked at them over the weekend and thought I had some take-home messages here. You can see from Dairyland Labs, we've got a 5-year average and then 2016. And the bottom line is pretty good quality forage, actually. Really good quality forage. Actually, the one number I picked up, Mike, is RFQ was up a little bit compared to the 5-year average over here. And you can kind of see that over down here. On the bottom is a diagram showing the frequency distribution. So sometimes averages can be deceiving. You know, people can drown in lakes at averages 3 feet deep because there's some deep holes out here. And so you can look at those at your leisure. But that's about the only major thing I picked up here is on perhaps, if anything, a little bit higher quality due in RFQ. Pretty big numbers, 25,000 samples sitting here as well. Here's that same data illustrated again with the frequency distribution, and you again see a little bit of just skewing a little bit. The good news is you look at NDFD at 30 hours, the green line, good news again. So again, Steve, those of you up at Forage Dairyman, that alfalfa looks like you should feed actually a little bit better than normal because of the quality indices that are attached to it. And the good news, UNDF, another number we like to follow, of course, the new kid on the block, that's going the right direction as well. We want that number lower, which means it's going to clear the digestive tract quicker. You nutritionists, that might be an eye-opener because that may mean you have a little less functional fiber out there in the feeding program. Here's the corn silage. It came in 2 days ago. Again, Dairyland, 20,000 samples here. And you can see, if you look here, lots of starch. Not a big surprise. Remember that. And by the way, my fact checker here, Jim Ball, says that should be 16 billion bushels rather than 15 million. What's 3 zeros, as Donald would say. Anyway, lots of starch. You can see higher starch concentrations here as well. And of course, that reflects the slightly lower fiber numbers as you go across as well. So again, this corn silage is going to feed pretty well. You can see a really nice, again over here, if you look at NDFD numbers, I'm not sure that is statistical, Jim, but certainly it shows it should feed pretty well also. Here comes a very busy table that comes from Dairy One Labs. They split out the New York data only, and just exactly what Mike Rankin referred to, you can see if you look at, let's just pick on starch, if you look at all their samples that came in, roughly about 1,000 samples, about 30%. Not quite as much starch in their labs coming in, but lo and behold, you come over here to that drought and perhaps more drought stress, and there you're going to see that quality issue again, because Larry Chase said lots of the corn is short stocks, but still has a fairly decent ear in them as far as well. So again, the quality is going to be, looks like on the New York State, it's going to be good. The quantity may be reduced as well. And again, you can study this at your leisure. We're going to come back and look at this nitrate here in just a second. We then go back here, and here's the legumes and grasses again. You can take a look at, and much like the Dairyland Labs here, you can look, this is mostly legumes here, and again, you can see that there are some differences on protein that wouldn't surprise you, our RFV numbers. Look at those at your leisure. You can study those or print those off, as Steve has mentioned a bit earlier. Here's the grass, and mostly grass, so they had lots of good data there as well to share with you as listeners here today on the webinar. Then the other one that came from Cumberland Valley Analytics, you can see, I thought this was kind of a neat table, and Jim did some neat things here. Here you can see about, looks like about 9 or 10 different states here. The blue number says the winner, so you can see, if you look at corn silage, you can see a little bit drier corn silage in New York. That probably reflects maybe a little bit of the drought situation over here. You then come over here, and you can look at some of your other numbers here. NDF digestibility, New York wins that one again. You can pick your favorite numbers here, and you can see there's quite a bit of variation in terms of quality coming out of that lab as well. And sure enough, here's that big starch number again at 35. Hang on to your hats. Some of you aren't going to believe this, but I've had several farmers share, and nutritionists. We've seen starches in Illinois over 45% starch, and this was not a high cut. They were not cutting it high either as far as that goes. So lots of potential starch sitting out there. And as one farmer said, we did hit 300 bushels certain times in the field as they were bringing in their corn this last week. So then let's look at a few other challenges here in harvest in 2016 as we go through this. I'm going to open up the polls and ask, what are you seeing where you live? And again, go ahead and open the polls up. Jim is doing that right now. And the question is, what's going to impact your forage feeding program? Are you going to see a delay harvest and chopping of corn silage? Is that going to be a problem where you live or on your farm? Are you going to fight with drought stress forages? I got a feeling if you're voting Wisconsin, you're not going to check that box. Again, this is multiple check. You can do vote more than one. Risk of mycotoxins and molds. We're seeing some of that pop up. More of that in just a minute. What about this variability in quality of these legume and grass forages? And of course, the good news could be is no problems, man. We are home free. We're not seeing any problems at all. So we're off and running here. Steve, you going to check any of those boxes?
Well, there is delayed chopping of corn silage and grain in much of Wisconsin, especially in the southwest part of the state. There's going to be some corn out there that's going to be chopped way too dry, unfortunately. We are in very early stages of combining our grain across the state. We'll be getting our crop update later today, but as of last week, less than 10% of the corn and soybeans had been combined, and there was not a lot of field work across our part of the state until this past weekend. So which opens up the possibility of some mycotoxins and molds in our grain crops. So I would have to say delayed harvest of corn, silage, and some quality problems that we need to keep an eye on.
Well, Jim, let's share the numbers, and we're off and running here, and you can all see that pretty much reflects Steve's comments as far as that goes. 11% of you say, we looking great, man. Life is good. Life is good, and we're not going to have a problem. So we're going to move on then and move on to our start wrapping this thing up as our time gets away from us here. What are some of the unique challenges by various regions? And we're going to touch on each of these very briefly here in today's webinar. The drought-stressed corn silage, risk of nitrates in that stressed corn silage, the delay harvest, and Steve alluded to some of those already, and then, of course, the presence of mycotoxins. And we do have some data to back some of these things up for you as well. So certainly we know that there's going to be tremendous variation if you're in the drought stress situation with these corn plants. We are seeing, according to Dr. Chase, shorter plants but still some ear formation. There are some situations there is no ear because of poor pollination or drought challenges out there as well. And of course, starch numbers and NDF digestibilities are going to vary a great deal. Steve alluded to the ensiling risks. Certainly, we're going to have to get these processors doing a good job on some of this drought-stressed corn because the kernels are going to be very, very hard and smaller in size. And we're going to have to adjust the length of chop because of compaction and trying to control the fermentation process out there on farms. If you're going to buy this, and we had this question come in a couple of weeks ago, buying drought-stressed corn from neighboring grain farmers because there may not, in some situations, be enough grain out there, then we are saying consider buying. Be sure you buy it on a dry matter basis because, again, the moisture is that we don't have milk lines to monitor quite as well. And so if corn silage is $40 a ton, and actually that's probably going to be close to $30 a ton there at 33% dry matter, then you can work out a cost and adjust that drought-stressed corn or that drier corn, if it happened to be in Wisconsin, on the dry matter base there. And then so adjust for dry matter, adjust for starch, and we in Illinois would use 30%. So if starch is higher than 30%, I'm going to pay you a bit more, and then I'm going to use NDF digestibility 30 hours, again, to see if we are going to adjust if it has higher NDF digestibilities. So again, if you're going to be buying drought-stressed corn, late chopped corn, whatever the situation is, make sure you adjust for dry matter, starch, and NDF digestibility. The nitrate levels, you saw that in an earlier slide that came from Dairy 1. The numbers, we are pleased to see this, are modestly low. It looks like, at least in New York State, there's not going to be a big problem here. The bigger problem is going to be the big dry matter range. You can see those numbers all over the map as far as that goes. That's the magic number. If you're looking, and this is a nitrate, not nitrate nitrogen. If yours is nitrate nitrogen, divide that by about factor of 4, so it's 0.11%. So you can see all these samples, the highest one that came in the New York lab still was sitting at basically 2,700 parts per million nitrate, which would be a fairly safe. This is total ration as well, total ration dry matter. If you got an ear, it's a pretty good chance it's going to be reduced in nitrates. There's a source for those nutrients to go. And of course, ensiling will reduce 30%, anywhere from 15 to 35. Some cases you can find some research that say as much as 50%. And again, if we get some of these late rains and the crop no longer is viable, then of course the roots continue to suck up the moisture and nitrates, and of course they pile up in the plant portion of the plant. So here we show you the data that comes from Cumberland Labs. You can see the percent of samples. And this is this 2016 harvest season. Again, you can see lots of samples going, so they're getting lots of samples coming into their lab. And the good news is you can see here is kind of your cut point, if you want to call your cut point, and you can see that is less than 1%. So it appears as it comes into the lab, probably fresh cut at that point. It looks like that's not going to be a huge factor, but eyes wide open. And safety factors for some of you in silos with silo gases. Here's the wet condition. Mike did a nice job. Again, we just picked on us here in the Midwest. And Jim Baltz has generated some numbers for us. This is looking pretty good, actually, but you can see up here, there is some mud in this field as well. Let's kind of show you a case study here if we can. Here's that same field after we got one of these big Midwest rains that came through 2.5 inches. And you can see they're chopping corn silage. And let me tell you, you don't put too many claws choppers out in this field here when this happens out there on your farm. So what happened on that farm, you can see, isn't this kind of sobering? You can see here is the big bunker of feed. It's exposed. It's open. Here we got 3 packing tractors over here. We've got about 8 or 9, 4 or 5 semis, 3 or 4 loaders here, 3 or 4 cloth choppers standing there waiting to go. And of course, that is really concerning if you're going to try to make high quality corn silage, because the corn silage doesn't wait and the bunker doesn't ferment quite as well as we cover it. So Jim got this data from one of our farmers here, and so you can see they started making silage here in the middle of August. We had a break here that occurred, but now we come over here and take a look over here, and now you can see that we've got these big breaks here due to wet conditions. And so as a result, you can see we had anywhere a 4-day break in which we really couldn't bring in appreciable amount of silage into the program. Some other things that are occurring here in the Midwest to have your eyes wide open for, sprouted corn. And this is happening in parts of southern Illinois where the ears did not tip down because of maturity. Steve points out the rain came in, and so now we have moisture that accumulates, and now we have what we call sprouting corn in the field before we chop it for silage or harvest it for grain. Diplodia is another factor that comes into play. Here it is. You can see this is discolored corn over here. Here's the good corn. Here's a cob that's a very much of extreme as far as that goes. And so diplodia is going to can be a problem out there as well. Primarily gray to brownish colors. The good news, no mycotoxins, but serious dockage if you get over 5% of the kernels showing that damage. Another concern we had in the midsummer was southern rust. Here in parts of Illinois, that reduces yield, allows the plant to kind of start to senesce or die out there, and that can lead to mycotoxin risk problem as well. So not all cake and honey for us as well. Then we take a look at some data that comes from Dairyman Labs. And again, you can look at this data. This is mold counts. I don't have a good number to give you as listeners. I do on yeast counts. That's 1 million. But here you see mold counts, and you can see some pretty significant mold counts occurring over here. That is a percent of the samples. Here are the various types of molds that was identified by Dairyman Labs over here. And you can see Mucor was the more common one there, some Fusariums there as well. Here is your yeast counts over here. And again, the number I tend to use is 1 million. And so you can see we have some very high yeast counts. And so that may indicate we're going to have some excitement in terms of when we start going feed out here. Of course, the real winner there is acetic acid. So if some of you use some of the Lactobacillus buchneri, which will increase acetic acid levels in corn silage, that's going to be a plus because they really retard the yeast from growing. And the problem we hear is the yeast grow, and as a result, the yeast grow, they convert the lactic acid, they break it down, and then we allow the molds to pop in and take off as well. So certainly that's going to be a factor. And again, you can kind of see what their counts, modest numbers of counts of 200, but this is this year's corn. Our thanks to Dairyland for sharing it. Now here comes your mycotoxins. And there's good news, generally speaking here. Again, you can see aflatoxin, the magic number is over 20 parts per billion. Let me get it right there this time, Jim. You can see no problems there. That's usually considered a drought problem. Usually we see more of that in Texas. You might see a little bit more of that in New York and some of those drought areas that Mike talked about a bit earlier. Then we come down here to zearalenone. The magic number is 300. That is what we're using for zearalenone, under 300. So again, you can see very few samples are going to be at risk there. And these are a lot fairly clean as we get over here. Here comes my vomitoxin, or DON if you wish. And the number we're using there is 5 parts per million. Yep, that's million. 5. And so again, you can see now we've got some more challenges. We've got some samples popping up down here. Those numbers I'm giving you, they pop up in the next PowerPoint. Those are total ration. So again, one of the solution here could be dilution as well. Here comes your T2. That's a really mean one as far as that goes. And we want to be below 100 parts per billion. And the good news is we only had one outlier sitting over here. And there was 53 of those that came in as well. So we're seeing a little bit more activity as I talked with Dairyman Labs last week. More samples coming in. And I understand Extension is going out with some programs in Wisconsin as well. These are what we use at the University of Illinois, DON or vomitoxin, aflatoxin, T2 zearalenone, and these are our trigger numbers, and that is the total ration dry matter, so just be aware of that as well. If we have microtoxins, especially the ones that we were talking about earlier, we would suggest you're going to look at some of the moss and glucomanins to probably try to tie up those microtoxins, also known as yeast cell wall extracts. These look to be pretty effective as far as that goes, and these are the ones that we were concerned about, especially the DON or the vomitoxin over here. Typical levels, 10 grams. Some cases will go up to try to get ahead of it with 20 or 30 grams here, and of course, economics become a factor. Up here, your clay minerals are pretty effective against aflatoxin out here as well. But again, we don't see a lot of that probably this fall, at least here in the Midwest. Chopping corn silages. Basically, we saw the challenge that you're going to be facing over here to get that job done. Here is the Penn State separator, and I thought I would just put this up here. Let's just focus on corn silage first. These are Illinois guidelines. Penn State have slightly wider ranges, as you'll see here in just a minute. Shredlage, you can see you're going to have about a third of it sitting in the top box over here, a third sitting in the second box. If you've got a traditional processor, such as the Kloss processor that we have there, or what we call the Shredlage processor, you're going to see probably 10 or 12% in the top box and over 60% in the second box as well. So certainly depending on which technology you're using out there, we'd expect these numbers. So the question is, did you chop it right? Now remember when Steve said we're getting these drier corn silages, this is 3/4 of an inch, I would probably go to 1/2 inch theoretical length of chop. Yes, you're going to see this number really dropping significantly here, but hopefully we'll pick up most of it over here as well. So the question is, how did you chop your corn silages, or if you are still chopping, what adjustments would you make? Here sits my haylage numbers. This is primarily coming out of bags, bunkers, and piles feed. We like to see over 40% in the top box, over 40% in the second box. Now, just a quick comment. Here is the third box. This is the 1.1 millimeter or 1100 micron screen. I say that because now I will show you the new screen. This is the 4 millimeter screen. This is the new box that's came out from Penn State, and now you can see these numbers really start jumping around. And what they're doing is they're taking the feed from this box and moving it over to this box over here as well. So just be eyes wide open if you're using a Penn State box. If you're a dairy farmer, nutritionist, which box do you have? And now these are the Penn State guidelines. Notice on their TMRs, they are much more conservative, if you want to use that term, or whatever you want to do in terms of the top box over here. You can see that number there is quite a bit lower than we have. Notice we're at 8 to 12. We used to be up at 15. We think we backed that down based on some new data that came out of Canada. And oh, by the way, happy Thanksgiving to our Canadians that are on the line. It's Thanksgiving Day in Canada. So I won't say anything about turkeys. We'll just leave that all alone for now as far as humor goes. So again, be well aware of how did your corn silages and your haylage chop this year. You can see some fairly big ranges in some of these numbers that you will have to navigate through yourself. Dairyland also gave me data from last year, 2015, in terms of a corn silage processing score. And what you want to be is, as you can see in the green, you want to be over 70. And so you can see 23% of our corn silage last year. Obviously, we don't have this year's corn silage coming in. That'll be interesting to see. But 23% got a score over 70. Notice some people really are really doing a job on those corn kernels as well. This is the amount of starch that's sitting in the lower boxes. Another 2/3 had it out in kind of the middle of the road over here, and then I get over here, and you can see 14% big trouble. The significance comes from Dr. Randy Shaver. He says going from brown to blue is about 2 pounds or a liter more milk. Going from blue to green is another 2 pounds or a liter of milk. So we're simply saying, is that starch going to be available? And again, we're using this screen. That is a standard that comes. And look at this, 1,000 samples, a pretty good sample. I saw some data that came from Cumberland Valley, and it appears that on the New York or on the East Coast, they're getting a little higher numbers over here in the green area as far as that goes. Another test you can use to determine how good a job we did with processing our corn silage, our high moisture corn, our snaplages, our corns in general, and that is looking at dairy fecal starch. And this you can see in this last year. And the bad news is we lost some ground compared to 2014. You can see the magic number is trying to be less than 5%. Or if you're over 5% fecal starch, then that means you have left starch in the manure. And for every 1% change, that is about 0.6 of a pound of milk. So as you go from 6 to 7 to 8% to over here, that's about 1.5 pounds of milk that we're leaving basically in the feces of the cow. This probably reflects some of the kernel processing score data we saw a bit earlier. And you can see about 110 samples came in on this one to be looked at as well. Finally, let's start wrapping up here. Our time is just about gone, and hopefully we'll have some questions or discussion. And Mike Rankin, we may let you come in and kibitz here a bit as well. Making good feed decisions. One of our big farmers in Illinois actually tracked this out for us, and we want to thank him for sharing his data with us. This is actual 2016 data. Steve, he's almost kept up with you crooks and Hordes Dairyman there. His whole 1,200 acres averaged almost 28 tons wet basis there, 64% moisture. That you probably got that wet stuff at Hordes Dairyman. But we'll move on. Just kidding, of course. And so he's harvested, as you can see, 34,000 tons of corn silage. His costs, and that was his picture you saw there a bit earlier, 3 closses, packing tractors, trucks, transportation wagons, stuff like that. $10 a ton. A lot of us hear more of a chopping charge of around $4 to $6 to $7. But remember, this includes bringing that distances and also packing that with those big devices. His inoculant cost was $1 and $23 a ton. Some of you out there could see this down as low as below $1 a ton or over $3 a ton, depending on which brand you're using and which technology you're buying into. He's got an oxygen barrier going on his product. And on his bunkers there, so it was 99 cents a ton that he had for covering the corn silage, just to give you some benchmark numbers. So his bottom line number is $41 a ton. His corn silage was valued at basically $3.50 a bushel as I backed into this using the factor of 8, meaning that roughly when you take a ton of corn silage, that's got the equivalent of 8 bushels of corn in there. So that's so his corn silage went in at $28 a ton. So his corn silage could cost him sitting in the bunker about $40 a ton. If you take a shrink, and he used a 10% shrink value, Mike Rankin said that might be a bit conservative, but again, remember, he's packing, he's inoculating, and he's got oxygen barrier. He took a 10% shrink on that. That is the estimation. So he says to put it in front of his cows around $45 to $46 a ton. Another way to look at that is FeedVal 6, version 6. Some of you remember that as FeedVal 2012. 1112. And again, another way of evaluating feedstuffs. And then you can see this is the spreadsheet here. Jim actually ran the spreadsheet. You can actually look at it. Here is the quality, what they call good quality hay. You can see that the protein was 20% protein. You can see the net energy of 0.6. Poor quality, actually, you can see was about 16% protein and 0.5, so that's an important number to take a look at. But these are all the numbers. The good news with this, you can actually put your numbers in these boxes, and this program is free of charge. So you just got to Google this. You'll get it free of charge. You can run it on your farms. Here are the breakouts that we can take a look at. What was put in by the Wisconsin group there, and this would be in September. So right now, in fact, about $3.42 a bushel. Remember, we said some of you are going to see this quite a bit lower than that. And here's the break-even price. So it says corn is pretty cheap. It's worth up to about $4.80 a bushel. Our crop guys would love to see that number. You dairymen are buying it, don't want to see that. Soybean meal went in at $3.59. That's pretty much break even. Again, we expect to see if that big soy price crop comes in, that could be down around $3.25 or even a little bit lower. They put corn silage in at $34 a ton. That looks to be a bit low. The break even you can see is roughly $50 a ton. Just about you can compare that. Here sits your hay prices. You can see pretty close to what Mike was talking about there. This computer doesn't look at some other important factors with hay, but you can see that is not a good buy. And now you can see the low quality stuff is a good buy. There sits your corn stalks and straw as a look at. Here's some of your grain. Some people are interested in looking at that. Let's pick fuzzy cottonseed. Remember, I said $2.45. I could lock that price in right now. So Feedval is still not a big fan of fuzzy cottonseed. But remember, they were not putting a value on oil. And if you're going to really price out fuzzy cottonseed, you got to put oil on it. Look at all these other byproduct feeds. Really good buys, and you can see that as we go through it. And finally, let's wrap up here with feed metrics. Here are the prices I used. You may not like them, but that's what I used here preparing for the webinar. You can see my prices listed here. This is cost per pound of dry matter. We then go to the next PowerPoint. Mike Hutjens Magic 50-pound dry matter ration. You can see my forages drop down quite a bit compared to other years here. Here they're all listed as well. So there's your $4.11. And remember, I said the cost per hundredweight of milk at 70 pounds of milk of $5.87. You can see if those Holstein cows give me 80 pounds of milk, that actually goes down around $5 per cow per hundredweight of milk. Income over feed cost, if I use $17 milk, and maybe that's being a bit generous right now. If you look at the futures, they're looking more like 15. So again, these numbers all go down, and of course my feed efficiency sits there as well. So I guess that completes our take-home message I think Mike and I would hopefully agree on, and that is certainly that it looks like forage quality is going to be pretty good this year, Mike. I'll give you equal time to rebuttal that, like we saw last night during the debate as far as that goes. Lots of variation within farm, within cutting, within region, and here in the United States as far as that goes. And it looks like feed costs are going to be pretty economical, which is going to really impact people making decisions with the MPP program. Most of our guys are not going to pull the trigger. They're going to take the $4 level, but they're not going to buy up at higher levels here. And you know the old thumb rule is, Steve, it says cheap feed means cheap milk, expensive feed makes expensive milk, and that may be true here. So with that, I will stop there and see if we have any questions. Mike Rankin, do you want to make any comments on what my summary slide things I said?
No, I think we're right on there. There was a lot of really excellent quality alfalfa made this past year, especially those that were chopping versus baling, and I think. You really can't paint the picture that fits everybody. I am a little concerned with some of this drier corn silage.
Okay, very good. And Steve, we'll let you kind of wrap things up a little bit, and then we'll go back and handle a few questions.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you both, Mike Hutjens and Mike Rankin, for very interesting, timely, important presentation. This has been an interesting and in some respects challenging crop year, and it's great to have your perspective on it. I might just mention that there still would be time for those of you following us out there to print out the handouts, the PowerPoints. Go to the handout part of your menu, and you can do that. Certainly there are several PowerPoints that I want to study a little bit more carefully as they relate to the Forage Dairyman farm. Lots of good information there for advisors as well as dairy producers themselves. Want to mention that those of you who are with us today will receive a survey in the next few days. We'd like to have you respond to that. We invite your participation to make sure that we keep our webinar series on target and meeting your needs. And when you get that survey, there'll be an opportunity for you to sort of re-enlist or re-sign up for our webinar series. And we encourage you to do that to make sure that you stay on our mailing list and continue to receive information about the webinars. Finally, again, we want to thank Zinpro Performance Products or Minerals for their support of today's webinars. And now, looking ahead, if we could switch back. There we go. The webinar next month, November 14th, information around calving time. What's it mean and how should we approach it? A relatively new topic for the transition period, a new look at some of the challenges we face and what we can do about it. Dr. Barry Bradford, good young dairy scientist at Kansas State University, will be the presenter, sponsored by Virtus. And then looking a bit further ahead to December 12th, this might be considered part 2 of our crop and feed outlook. John Gesser from Rock River Labs, Gusser I think it is, from Rock River Labs will be speculating on how this year's forage will feed, and there'll be some more quality information reported after we've had a few more samples analyzed and some strategy there, sponsored by QLF. And we look forward to that presentation as well, and invite you to keep track of those dates and be with us also. Now, Mike, do we have some questions that either you, Mike Hutjens, or Mike Rankin need to address?
Right. Question for Mike Rankin, and that is, should I be buying my hay now, or should I wait until later in the winter to buy hay, assuming I can get it? Any idea on strategy of when to buy hay based on the data you presented to us?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's going to depend on what quality of hay you want to buy. I think if you're looking for average quality, that's going to be available probably throughout the winter. And even in the winter, sometimes the prices tend to run up. But if you can find a price you can live with on the dairy quality hay, the excellent hay, I think I would tend to want to lock that in now versus waiting till later on when there's going to be a lot less of it around and probably at a higher price.
Okay, then we had a question at Expo, actually, that fits very nicely with our webinar here today, and that is, what about feeding soybeans? In other words, with this big crop of soybeans out there, those soybeans maybe even on the farm, the question is, what about those soybeans? And so certainly that could be a good alternative to take a look at. We're going to run through FeedVal 12 or the version 6 and take a look at that ourselves. But if you're going to feed the soybean, by and large, if you feed them raw, you are going to have to grind them or process them. Otherwise, you're going to see them coming through in the manure. And you need to grind them a little bit because you want to expose the soybean to the anti-protein trypsin inhibitor factors that are sitting in the soybean. So you want the rumen bacteria to take them out and to allow for good protein digestibility in the lower tract. Second of all is that we also be well aware that this protein is fairly soluble, fairly degradable. and maybe as high as 60 or 70% rumen degraded protein. So the question came in, can I roast them? And of course you can roast them. You can roast these soybeans. The magic numbers from University of Wisconsin sits around 300 degrees, and then steep them or hold them for 30 minutes. And that should give you a desirable shifting the rumen undegraded protein up as high as 50 to 60%, depending on how good of job you do roasting and controlling them temperatures. The reason I stress that is because lysine is fairly heat sensitive. So if you go too high a temperature, you can actually destroy some of the lysine. So be very aware these time and temperatures are very, very important. The good news is that if you do have roasted soybeans, you can send a sample to some of our commercial labs here in the Midwest, and they can run a protein dispersion index known as a PDI, protein dispersion index, and that number should be somewhere around 12, 13, 14%. Actually, guys and gals, it's a solubility test that you can actually run on the soybeans. The last comment is that now you don't want to grind the roasted soybeans, you want to crack them. Again, if you ever had roasted soybeans, they're very hard. They're as hard as a peanut. And so if you don't process them, trust me, you're going to have them coming through in the fecal material, and you want to put them into quarters or eighths. That's based on some Ohio State research. Why not grind them? For two reasons. Number one, you expose more of the protein to the rumen microbes so that we can tear that down and make that, you lose some of your RUP values as far as that goes. Second of all, as you process a soybean finer, you bring the oil out, and those are polyunsaturated or PUFAs, and those oils can really hammer the rumen fermentation process and affect butterfat tests. So be eyes wide open on that one as well. Also, once you process them, then of course the oil becomes more exposed to rancidity. So I guess I would not grind a year's worth ahead. I would probably grind it as needed or process on the farm. The last one is the PDI check. Several years ago, a commercial company here in the Midwest checked, and the on-farm roasters have their hands full. If you're buying roasted soybeans from a commercial company that have the technique to cool and to heat and to stabilize the temperature, that you're probably going to get a better job. So the roasted soybeans on-farm can be done as low as $20 to $40 a ton. I've heard those numbers, depending on what the price of gas on those farms are going to be. Natural gas, then obviously that makes a difference as well. So there we go. We also had a comment here from the Netherlands that said very high energy grass silage, and others have low quality as far as that goes, and their corn has lots of water damage. And their yields are sitting at about 35 tons per hectare. That'd be about 14 tons per acre, thanks to Jim Baltz did the conversion for us here as well. So the Netherlands looks like they're going to have somewhat similar situations that we're having here as well. Another question came in. Do you see differences in the Dawn test in corn silage versus corn shredlage? I can't answer that question. I assume they're wondering. The real key on that is to be sure. I think most of that damage is going to be coming from the field. That would be my take, but I'm not we might ask John Geiser that when he's here in December with their labs there. But I don't think we'll see much difference in the corn itself, depending on the Zearalenone Dawn, corn silage, if it's processed or if it's shredlage, as long as, Mike already points out, as long as we get it to ferment. If it doesn't ferment, then evil things can happen. And so I think it's going to be more of a packing issue there. And you could wonder out loud, can I get it packed quite as tightly with shredlage when I got 30% on the top box versus I have a quarter, a half-inch processed corn silage there. So remember, that processor can do two things. It can go in and adjust the particle size of the silage, and then, of course, it can crush the kernels as far as that goes. Mike, maybe you want to answer this question or jump in some other comments. Chopping corn too dry or too wet. What are the cut points? You want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, I think, I'm typically of the opinion in that 65 to 68% moisture range. I'm sure, Mike, you've been through this as much as I have. I think I tend to be tend to be a little more concerned when we get down around 60%. I mean, I think it becomes pretty paramount that you're processing that stuff. And I know, I know because of the wet fields, there may be some people that are still going to try to go out and get some of this corn, but it's just too dry. I don't know what you think, Mike.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. If there's corn there, I would take the doggone corn and I would harvest the corn grain. Either there's high moisture or dry corn from there. My cut point would be when it's over 35% dry matter. I'm going to shorten her down to a half inch with my processors, and I make sure she's down to 1 millimeter. I really got to crush that kernel. I have to crush that kernel. And I'm with you, Mike. And when you get over 40, you're on your own. Don't look at me. I'm not even sure an inoculant is going to be able to save your neck as far as that goes. I'm not sure you can get it packed. That's what scares me. And I tell you, moldy silage is not God's gift to high-producing dairy cows as far as that goes. I think we've covered all the points, Steve. If you want to wrap her up, I think we've got them all covered.
For all of you for joining us today, we appreciate the support of Zimbro Performance Minerals. We thank Jim Baltz down there at the University of Illinois for his good support and graphic help, and Patty Hutjens up here on our staff. We especially want to thank our presenters today, Mike Hutjens down there also at the University of Illinois, frequent contributor and co-host of the program, and of course we want to thank Mike Rankin, also editor of Hay Forage Grower magazine. And speaking of Hay Forage Grower, that publication is having a webinar next Monday at noon Central Time, and the presenter will be Mark McCaslin from Forage Genetics Incorporated, and he's going to be discussing attempts to increase digestibility by 10 to 15% through delaying harvest while maintaining quality. He's had 30-some years of alfalfa breeding experience. He's well known, and for those of you in feeding forage, advising on forage in the forage business, that sounds like a very interesting webinar to take part in. Again, thank you all for joining us. We look forward to having you with us on our future webinars. And that's Steve Larson from Forage Dairyman up here signing off for this month. Look forward to having you back.